The pattern does not respect borders. It does not confine itself to American wilderness or European mountains or Asian highlands. It repeats across continents, across cultures, across terrain types that share nothing except the capacity to make people disappear. When researchers began documenting unexplained wilderness disappearances in the United States, they assumed the phenomenon was local. Something about American forests, American deserts, American mountains seemed to produce cases that resisted conventional explanation. The sheer scale of American wilderness, they reasoned, created conditions that other countries did not replicate. They were wrong. The same patterns that appear in Yosemite appear in the Scottish Highlands. The same dynamics that characterize disappearances in Olympic National Park repeat in the Cordillera Blanca of Peru. The same questions that haunt families in Tennessee haunt families in the Netherlands, in Canada, in Nepal. The wilderness produces the same unexplained outcomes everywhere. This video examines cases from 5 countries across 4 continents. The victims range from university professors to gap-year students, from experienced mountaineers to casual day hikers. The terrain ranges from Pacific Northwest rainforest to Central American jungle to Himalayan trekking routes. The common elements are not geographic. They are procedural, popular trails, experienced travelers, adequate preparation, and outcomes that make no sense. Each case involves trails that see regular traffic. Each involves people who understood what they were doing. Each involves searches that should have produced results but did not. And each leaves questions that official investigations have never fully answered. The international scope of these cases challenges assumptions about what causes wilderness disappearances. If the phenomenon were purely American, purely environmental, purely the result of specific terrain features or wildlife populations, it should not repeat with such consistency across such different landscapes. But it does repeat. The pattern persists regardless of hemisphere, regardless of climate, regardless of the nationality of the missing. If you find value in examination of cases that cross borders and challenge explanation, subscribe to this channel. We document patterns that demand attention. We present evidence without forcing conclusions. We ask questions that investigators in multiple countries have failed to answer. Our first case involves a university professor who disappeared in one of America's most visited national parks. He was experienced, prepared, and following a route he had researched extensively. He sent a message saying everything was fine. Then he vanished completely, leaving behind only his vehicle and an empty trail. Dubal was 33 years old when he drove into Mount Rainier National Park on October 9, 2020. He was an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Washington in Seattle, specializing in medical anthropology with a focus on issues of health, inequality, and social justice. His academic work examined how marginalized communities experience healthcare systems, research that had earned him recognition in his field and respect from colleagues who described him as brilliant, dedicated, and deeply compassionate. His friends called him Sam. They described a man who balanced intense intellectual work with physical activity, who found in hiking and outdoor exploration the same kind of engagement he brought to his research. The mountains of the Pacific Northwest had become his regular escape from the pressures of academic life, the place where he processed ideas and recharged for the demands of teaching and writing. He was not a casual hiker. He had accumulated years of experience on trails throughout Washington state, including multiple trips to Mount Rainier. He understood the mountain's reputation for unpredictable weather, its glaciated terrain, its capacity to challenge even experienced mountaineers. He prepared accordingly, researching routes, checking conditions, and informing others of his plans. His plan for the October weekend was a solo overnight loop that would take him through the Mother Mountain area and along portions of the Carbon River drainage. The route was ambitious but within his capabilities. It would involve approximately 20 miles of hiking over 2 days, with camping at a backcountry site on the night of October 9th. He expected to return to his vehicle at Moich Lake on October 10th. Moich Lake sits in the northwestern corner of Mount Rainier National Park, accessible by a 14-mile unpaved road that closes each winter when snow makes passage impossible. The lake itself occupies a cirque below the Moach face of Rainier, surrounded by meadows that bloom with wildflowers in summer and turn golden in autumn. By October, the area sees reduced visitor traffic as the season transitions toward winter closure. Sam arrived at the Moach Lake parking area on the morning of October 9th. Rangers later confirmed his vehicle, a dark-colored sedan, was present in the lot throughout the period of his disappearance. He apparently departed on foot as planned, beginning the loop that would take him through the backcountry he had selected. That evening, at approximately 6:30, he sent a text message to family members. The message indicated that everything was proceeding according to plan, that he was in good spirits, and that conditions were acceptable. The tone was casual, the communication of a person following a familiar script. He had done this before. He expected to do it again. That message was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Sam Dubal. When he failed to return home on October 10th as expected, his family became concerned. When he did not appear at the university on the morning of October 11th, concern transformed into alarm. Family members contacted the National Park Service to report him overdue. Rangers checked the Moach Lake parking area and confirmed that his vehicle remained where he had left it. The car was locked and undisturbed. His hiking plan, which he had filed with family rather than officially with the park, indicated the route he intended to follow. Everything suggested he had departed on his hike and had not returned. Search and rescue operations began immediately. The Park Service deployed ground teams, helicopters, and search dogs. Volunteers from regional mountain rescue organizations joined the effort. The terrain they faced was challenging. Forested ridges, glacial moraines, creek drainages, and alpine meadows now dusted with early-season snow. October in the Pacific Northwest brings unpredictable weather. The week of the search saw conditions that complicated operations. Fog that grounded helicopters, precipitation that ranged from rain at lower elevations to snow higher up, temperatures that dropped well below freezing at night. The terrain that Sam had planned to traverse became progressively more difficult to search as autumn yielded to approaching winter. Search teams covered the Mother Mountain Loop and surrounding areas systematically. They hiked the trails he would have used. They checked the backcountry campsite where he planned to spend the night. They searched off-trail areas where a person might have wandered if injured or disoriented. They examined creek drainages and ravines where a fall could have occurred. They found nothing. No tent, no sleeping bag, no backpack, no clothing, no equipment of any kind. The wilderness that had received Sam Dubal offered no evidence that he had ever passed through it. Search dogs were brought in to track his scent. The results were inconclusive. The dogs could not establish a clear trail beyond the immediate vicinity of the trailhead. Whether this reflected the passage of time, weather conditions that had degraded scent, or some other factor could not be determined. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew patterns over the search area during evening hours, when temperature differentials between a human body and the surrounding terrain would be most pronounced. They detected nothing consistent with a person, alive or deceased. The search continued at high intensity for 9 days. Over 100 personnel participated at the peak of operations. They covered terrain extending miles in all directions from his planned route. They found no trace of Sam Dubal. As conditions deteriorated and the probability of finding a survivor approached zero, the Park Service made the difficult decision to scale back active search efforts. The case transitioned from rescue to recovery, then to periodic checks as weather permitted. Winter arrived. Snow buried the trails and meadows where Sam had planned to hike. The area became inaccessible until the following spring. If he had collapsed somewhere in the backcountry, the snow would preserve him, in theory, until conditions allowed renewed searching. Spring came. Summer followed. Search teams returned to the area, checking locations that had been inaccessible during winter. Hikers who traveled through the region were asked to report any unusual findings. The Park Service maintained awareness of the case. Nothing was found. Not in the spring of 2021. Not in the summer. Not in the years that followed. Sam Dubal remains officially classified as a missing person. His vehicle was eventually recovered from the parking lot. His apartment in Seattle remained as he had left it, a life interrupted mid-sentence. His academic work continued through the efforts of colleagues who completed projects he had begun. But Sam himself, the person who had driven to Mowich Lake on an October morning to hike a trail he had researched and prepared for, has never been seen again. The investigation examined the circumstances with attention to both conventional explanations and the anomalies that conventional explanations could not address. The first factor was his experience level. Sam was not a novice making beginner mistakes. He had hiked extensively in the Pacific Northwest, including in Mount Rainier National Park. He understood the terrain, the weather patterns, and the risks. His choice of route was ambitious but consistent with his abilities. He was not attempting something beyond his skill level. The second factor was his preparation. He had filed a hiking plan with family. He had communicated his intended route and timeline. He had the equipment appropriate for an October overnight in the Cascades. He was not underprepared for the conditions he expected to encounter. The third factor was the timing of his final message. He sent word that evening saying everything was fine. This message came at approximately the time he would have been establishing camp or finishing his first day of hiking. If something had gone wrong before that message, he presumably would have communicated differently. If something went wrong after, the window was narrowing toward darkness and the beginning of his second day. The fourth factor was the weather. Conditions during and after his trip were challenging, but not unprecedented for October in the Cascades. Rain, fog, and snow at higher elevations would have complicated travel, but should not have been fatal for an experienced hiker with appropriate gear. Other people hiked in the area during the same period without incident. The fifth factor was the total absence of evidence. 9 days of intensive searching by over 100 personnel with dogs, helicopters, and thermal imaging found nothing. Not a piece of equipment, not a shred of fabric, not any physical evidence that Sam had traveled beyond the trailhead. The wilderness had apparently absorbed him completely. The investigation developed several theories to explain what might have happened. The first theory was a fall into a glacial crevasse. Mount Rainier is heavily glaciated, and some of the terrain in the Carbon River drainage includes areas where crevasses could trap a person. If Sam had wandered onto glacial ice and fallen into a crevasse, his body might be concealed below the surface in a location that would be extremely difficult to search. This theory faced challenges. The route he planned did not require crossing heavily crevassed terrain. While it is possible he deviated from his intended path, the specific location of any such deviation could not be determined without knowing where he actually traveled. And searching the extensive glaciated areas of the mountain for a single crevasse containing a body would require resources beyond what any search operation could deploy. The second theory was a fall into a creek drainage or ravine. The terrain in the search area includes steep slopes and deep drainages where a fall could be fatal, and where a body could be concealed by vegetation or debris. If Sam had slipped while crossing a creek or traversing a steep slope, he might have fallen into a location that searchers did not discover. Ground teams checked accessible drainages without finding evidence. However, some terrain was too steep or too vegetated to search thoroughly. A body concealed in dense undergrowth or wedged in a narrow ravine might escape detection, even in an intensive search. The third theory was a medical emergency. Perhaps Sam suffered a heart attack, stroke, or other sudden medical event that incapacitated him. He would have collapsed somewhere along his route and died before he could call for help. But a medical emergency would leave a body. He would be lying on a trail, in a meadow, beside a creek, somewhere in the terrain he was traversing. 9 days of searching should have located him if he had simply collapsed, unless he collapsed in a location that was somehow concealed from search efforts. This theory does not explain the complete absence of any evidence. The fourth theory was animal predation. Bears and mountain lions are present in Mount Rainier National Park. Perhaps Sam encountered a predator and was killed, his remains scattered by scavengers before searchers arrived. Predator attacks on adult humans in the Pacific Northwest are extremely rare. When they occur, they typically leave evidence: blood, torn clothing, drag marks. The search found no such signs, and even if predators had killed Sam and scattered his remains, some evidence should have been discoverable by the dogs and ground teams that covered the area. The fifth theory was foul play. Perhaps Sam encountered another person in the backcountry who harmed him. Perhaps his disappearance was not an accident, but the result of human violence. No evidence supported this theory. No suspicious individuals were identified in the area. No witnesses reported seeing anyone behaving unusually. The remote location and timing made a chance encounter with someone intent on harm extremely unlikely. And concealing evidence of violence in the wilderness, while possible, would be difficult to achieve with the thoroughness that the absence of any evidence suggested. The sixth theory was voluntary disappearance. Perhaps Sam chose to vanish, to leave his life behind and start over somewhere else. Perhaps his trip to Mount Rainier was the beginning of a planned departure rather than a hiking trip gone wrong. This theory was investigated through examination of his finances, communications, and personal circumstances. Nothing suggested he was planning to disappear. His bank accounts showed no unusual activity. His communications showed no evidence of secret arrangements. His work was proceeding normally. His relationships gave no indication of stress that might motivate flight. Colleagues and friends uniformly described a person engaged with his life, not someone seeking escape from it. The seventh theory acknowledged that the available evidence did not support any confident conclusion. Sam Dubal had driven to a trailhead, sent a message saying he was fine, and then vanished without leaving any trace that searchers could identify. What happened in the hours after that message remains unknown. His family has continued seeking answers. They have worked with investigators, consulted with search professionals, and maintained awareness of the case in hopes that someone, sometime, will provide information that explains what happened to Sam. The University of Washington has honored his memory through academic tributes that acknowledge both his scholarly contributions and the mystery of his absence. He was, by all accounts, a person who brought passion to understanding how systems fail vulnerable people. The system that failed to find him remains one whose workings he never had the chance to study. Mount Rainier continues to draw visitors each year. The trails Sam planned to hike remain open to those who seek the beauty and challenge of the Pacific Northwest Mountains. Most return safely, their trips completed as planned, their families never needing to wonder what happened in the hours after a reassuring message. For the Dubal family, that wondering continues. The trailhead where Sam parked his car remains an ordinary patch of gravel. The wilderness beyond remains as it has always been, beautiful and indifferent and silent about what it knows. 3,000 miles to the southeast, in terrain that shares nothing with the temperate rainforests of Washington except the capacity to make people vanish, two young women were about to embark on a walk that would become one of the most analyzed disappearances in recent history. The case generated thousands of pages of investigation, spawned multiple documentaries, and continues to fuel debate about what happened in the hours and days after they left the populated valley and entered the green wall of the jungle. Kris Kremers was 21 years old. Lisanne Froon was 22. They were students from the Netherlands who had traveled to Panama as part of a gap experience that combined language study, volunteer work, and exploration of Central America. They had arrived in the country in mid-March of 2014, settling in the small mountain town of Boquete to study Spanish and prepare for a planned volunteer placement working with children. Boquete sits in the highlands of western Panama, in Chiriquí Province, near the border with Costa Rica. The town occupies a valley at approximately 4,000 feet elevation, surrounded by cloud forest-covered mountains that draw hikers, birdwatchers, and eco-tourists from around the world. The climate is cooler than the lowlands, the scenery spectacular, and the trails numerous enough to occupy visitors for weeks. The two women had become friends before the trip, united by shared interest in travel and adventure. Photographs from their time in Panama show young women enjoying their experience, posing at scenic overlooks, smiling at restaurants, documenting the ordinary pleasures of international travel. They were in regular contact with family in the Netherlands, sharing updates and photographs, maintaining the connection that responsible travelers preserve. On April 1, 2014, they decided to hike a popular trail called El Pianista, which climbs from the outskirts of Boquete into the forested mountains above the valley. The trail is well known locally, used by both tourists and residents. It follows a path that eventually leads toward the Continental Divide, where the watershed separating the Pacific and Caribbean slopes creates dramatic views and marks the beginning of more remote terrain. They departed in the late morning, dressed in light hiking clothes and carrying a backpack with supplies for a day hike. The weather was typical for the dry season, warm, partly cloudy, pleasant for walking. They did not hire a guide, a choice that was common among hikers on this particular trail. El Pianista was considered accessible enough that guidance was optional rather than necessary. A photograph taken by a local restaurant security camera captured them walking through town at approximately 11 in the morning, heading in the direction of the trailhead. Other witnesses reported seeing them on the trail during the early afternoon, making progress toward the higher elevations. These sightings were normal, unremarkable, consistent with two tourists enjoying a popular hike. They were never seen again. The first sign of concern came when they failed to arrive for a planned meeting with a woman who was coordinating their volunteer placement. When they could not be reached by phone, when they did not return to their lodging, when the hours stretched into days without contact, the alarm was raised. Search operations began on April 2nd, escalating rapidly as the seriousness of the situation became clear. Panamanian authorities, assisted by Dutch officials and eventually by specialized search teams from the Netherlands, scoured the trail and surrounding jungle. Helicopters flew patterns over the canopy. Ground teams hacked through vegetation. Local volunteers familiar with the terrain joined the effort. The search was hampered by the nature of the jungle itself. The cloud forest that makes Bouquet beautiful also makes searching for missing persons extraordinarily difficult. Visibility beneath the canopy is measured in feet rather than miles. The vegetation is dense, tangled, and unforgiving. Trails that seem clear at their start become progressively more challenging as they climb toward the divide. And beyond the divide, the terrain descends into indigenous Ngaba Bugle territory, a vast and sparsely populated region where search operations become logistically complex. Days passed without any sign of the women. The initial hope of finding them alive, perhaps injured but survivable, faded as the window for rescue closed. The search transitioned from rescue to recovery, then continued at reduced intensity as leads failed to materialize. Then, 10 weeks after they disappeared, a break in the case occurred. On June 14th, a local woman walking along the banks of a river called the Culebra, located well outside the initial search area, discovered a backpack sitting on a rock. The backpack belonged to Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon. The discovery transformed the investigation while simultaneously deepening its mysteries. The backpack was largely intact. Its contents were mostly dry despite the jungle environment and the weeks that had passed. Inside, investigators found items that the women had been carrying on the day they disappeared. 2 cell phones, one belonging to each woman, 2 pairs of sunglasses, a camera, cash in both Panamanian and American currency, bras belonging to both women, a water bottle, and crucially, both passports, the documents that any person planning to leave the country or change their identity would be unlikely to leave behind. The cell phones and camera contained data that would become the subject of intense analysis and speculation. The phones showed a pattern of emergency call attempts beginning on the afternoon of April 1st, the day they had departed for the hike. At 4:39 in the afternoon, one of the phones dialed 112, the European emergency number. The call did not connect. Minutes later, the other phone attempted 911, the number used in Panama. That call also failed. The attempts continued on April 2nd, April 3rd, and into the following days. The phones were turned on at various times, emergency numbers were dialed, and the calls failed to connect. The area where the calls were attempted apparently had no cellular coverage, meaning the phones could register the attempts but could not complete them. Analysis of the phone activity revealed a disturbing pattern. The phones were turned on repeatedly over the days following April 1st, with emergency call attempts continuing until the batteries died. The PIN codes required to fully unlock the phones were not entered during most of these attempts, suggesting that the person making the calls was either unable to remember the codes or was not the phone's owner. The final recorded activity on one phone was April 11th. The other phone's final activity was also April 11th. After that date, neither phone was turned on again. The camera contained 90 photographs that had not been seen before. The first photographs, taken on April 1st, showed the two women hiking the trail, posing at scenic points, documenting their journey in the manner that millions of tourists document theirs. The photographs were normal, cheerful, showing no signs of distress. The last daytime photograph was taken at approximately 1 in the afternoon on April 1st, showing what appeared to be a viewpoint near the Continental Divide. After that photograph, the camera's next recorded images were taken on April 8th, 7 days later. These subsequent photographs were taken at night. There were over 90 nighttime images taken between approximately 1 and 4 in the morning on April 8th. The photographs showed darkness, jungle vegetation, rocks, and what appeared to be pieces of plastic or paper that some analysts interpreted as possible trail markers or signals. One photograph showed the back of a head with what appeared to be red hair, likely belonging to Kris Kremers. The purpose of these nighttime photographs has never been definitively established. Some investigators believed they represented attempts to use the camera flash as a signaling device, hoping to attract the attention of rescuers. Others believed the photographs were meant to document the surroundings, perhaps for navigational purposes or to record what was happening. The darkness in the images was nearly total, making interpretation difficult. The gap between April 1st and April 8th, when no photographs were taken, remains unexplained. If the women were together and in possession of the camera throughout this period, why did they not take any photographs during 7 days? If they were separated from their equipment, how did it come back into their possession? The data raised questions that the investigation could not answer. Remains were discovered in the weeks following the backpack's recovery. A pelvis bone was found in the river downstream from where the backpack had been discovered. A boot containing a foot was found separately, with the foot later identified as belonging to Lisanne Froon. Additional bones belonging to both women were recovered from the jungle and the river over the following months. The condition of the remains became a subject of controversy. Some bones appeared to have been bleached, showing a degree of weathering that some experts considered inconsistent with the time elapsed since death. Other bones showed no signs of animal predation, which would be expected if the bodies had been exposed in the jungle for weeks. The fragmentary nature of the remains, with only portions of 2 bodies ever recovered, prevented definitive determination of cause of death. The official investigation concluded that the women had likely become lost after venturing beyond the Continental Divide, had been unable to call for help due to lack of cellular coverage, and had died of exposure, injury, or other causes in the jungle. Their remains had been dispersed by water and animals over the weeks before discovery. This conclusion has been challenged by numerous independent analysts who point to elements of the evidence that do not fit the accidental death scenario. The investigation examined the factors that contributed to the tragedy and the questions that remain unanswered. The first factor was the trail itself. El Pianista begins as a clear path, but becomes progressively more difficult beyond the Continental Divide. Hikers who continue past the divide enter terrain where trails are less defined and where the jungle closes in. If the women continued past the point where most day hikers turn around, they would have entered increasingly challenging terrain without necessarily recognizing the transition. The second factor was communication. Their phones could not connect to emergency services despite multiple attempts. If they had been injured or lost and unable to call for help, their situation would have deteriorated rapidly. The jungle at that elevation is cold at night, wet during rain, and provides little in the way of resources for survival without preparation. The third factor was the timeline suggested by the evidence. The phone data indicates they were attempting to call for help within hours of departing on their hike. Something had gone wrong by late afternoon on April 1st, but the nighttime photographs on April 8th suggest that at least one of them was alive and mobile 7 days later. What happened during those 7 days and what happened after April 8th remains unknown. The fourth factor was the condition and location of the remains. The bodies were found miles from the trail, in terrain that would have required significant travel through dense jungle. The fragmentary nature of the remains made determining cause of death impossible. Whether they died from falls, from exposure, from injury, or from some other cause could not be established. The fifth factor was the backpack and its contents. The backpack was found sitting upright on a rock, not discarded or swept downstream. Its contents were largely dry. The passports and money were still inside. The placement suggested deliberate positioning rather than random deposition by water. Who placed the backpack there and why has never been determined. The investigation developed multiple theories to explain what happened. The first theory was accidental death following becoming lost. The women continued hiking past the Continental Divide, became disoriented in the increasingly difficult terrain, could not call for help due to lack of coverage, and eventually died from exposure, dehydration, or injury. Their remains were scattered by water and animals. The backpack was carried downstream and deposited where it was found. This theory accounts for many elements of the evidence, but struggles with others. The gap in photographs between April 1st and April 8th, the condition of some remains, and the positioning of the backpack. The second theory was a fall or injury early in the hike. Perhaps one of the women fell and was injured, and the other attempted to seek help. Perhaps in trying to find assistance, the second woman also became lost. The phone calls beginning on April 1st afternoon would reflect attempts to summon help for an injured companion. This theory does not explain how at least one woman was apparently alive and active on April 8th, 7 days after the injury would have occurred. The third theory was criminal involvement. Perhaps the women encountered someone on the trail or beyond who harmed them. Perhaps their deaths were not accidental, but the result of violence that was subsequently concealed. Panamanian authorities investigated this possibility, but found no evidence supporting it. No suspects were identified. No witnesses reported seeing suspicious individuals. The remote location made a chance encounter with someone intent on harm unlikely. And concealing evidence of violence while leaving behind the backpack with its identifiable contents would have been an unusual choice for a perpetrator. The fourth theory was that the women became separated at some point. Perhaps one was injured or incapacitated while the other attempted to find help. Perhaps the phone activity and photographs represented the efforts of a single survivor rather than both women together. The fragmentary evidence is consistent with at least one person being alive and mobile through April 8th, but whether this was one woman or both cannot be determined. The fifth theory was that elements of the evidence were manipulated. Some analysts have pointed to what they consider anomalies: the dry condition of items in the backpack despite the wet environment, the positioning of the backpack on a rock, the condition of certain remains. These analysts suggest that the scene may have been altered, either by third parties or by natural processes not fully understood. This theory is speculative and lacks direct evidence. It represents an attempt to account for elements that do not fit conventional scenarios, rather than an explanation based on documented facts. The sixth theory acknowledged that the evidence is insufficient to determine what happened. 2 women entered the jungle and did not return. Their phones recorded emergency calls that did not connect. Their camera recorded nighttime photographs taken a week after they disappeared. Their remains were found fragmentary and dispersed. Their backpack was found apparently positioned on a rock. The sequence of events that produced this evidence cannot be reconstructed with confidence. The families of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon have sought answers for more than a decade. They have engaged investigators, commissioned analyses of the evidence, and maintained pressure on Panamanian authorities to continue the investigation. They have had to endure not only the loss of their daughters, but the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to them. The trail where they walked remains open to hikers. El Pianista continues to draw visitors to Boquete, some of whom are aware of what happened in April of 2014, and some of whom are not. The jungle beyond the Continental Divide remains as it has always been: dense, wet, unforgiving, and silent about the secrets it holds. The case has become one of the most discussed disappearances in the true crime community. Books, documentaries, and countless online analyses have examined every photograph, every phone log, every recovered bone. The discussions continue because the evidence permits multiple interpretations, because the official conclusion leaves questions unanswered, because two young women walked into the jungle, and what happened after remains a mystery. 2 cases examined, 2 different continents, 2 different landscapes, 1 professor hiking solo in a national park, 2 students hiking together on a popular trail. The specifics differ in every way except the outcome. People entered the wilderness, communicated that they were fine, and were never seen alive again. The pattern that connects these cases is not geographic. Mount Rainier and the Panamanian Highlands share nothing in terms of ecosystem, climate, or terrain. What they share is the capacity to make people disappear under circumstances that resist explanation. The searches were conducted, the evidence was gathered, the investigations concluded, and the families were left with questions that no one could answer. The patterns we document appear across continents. Understanding what they mean requires looking beyond any single case or any single country. The pattern crosses the Atlantic and extends into terrain that predates human memory. The Scottish Highlands have witnessed disappearances for centuries, their mist-shrouded mountains and vast moorlands creating conditions where people vanish with regularity that locals accept as part of the landscape's character. The Himalayas have claimed trekkers since Westerners first began walking their trails, the altitude and remoteness combining to produce outcomes that investigation struggles to explain. The next cases come from these ancient landscapes, places where the wilderness has had millennia to develop its capacity for concealment. The victims are different from those examined previously. The terrain is different. The investigating authorities operate under different protocols and face different challenges. But the outcomes share the same essential quality. People entered wild places, followed established routes, and vanished in ways that extensive searches could not resolve. The Scottish case involves a man whose body was eventually found, distinguishing it from most cases in this series. But the circumstances of his disappearance and the weeks that passed before discovery raise questions that the official conclusion of non-suspicious death does not fully address. The Nepali case involves a young American woman who vanished from a popular trekking route, her disappearance joining a pattern of missing travelers in that region that has never been adequately explained. Both cases demonstrate that the phenomenon documented in American wilderness extends across oceans and cultures. The wilderness speaks the same language in the highlands that it speaks in the Cascades. It offers the same silence in the Himalayas that it offers in the Panamanian cloud forest. Charles Kelly was 56 years old when he departed for a walking trip in the Scottish Highlands in the summer of 2023. He was a resident of Tillicoultry, a small town in Clackmannanshire, in the central belt of Scotland, where the lowlands begin their transition toward the mountainous north. He was described by those who knew him as an experienced hill walker, comfortable in the terrain that defines Scotland's identity and draws visitors from around the world. The Scottish Highlands encompass approximately 10,000 square miles of mountain, moorland, loch, and glen. The landscape is ancient, scraped by glaciers that retreated 10,000 years ago, leaving behind a terrain of dramatic peaks, deep valleys, and exposed ridges where weather can change within minutes. The highlands see weather systems that sweep in from the Atlantic, bringing rain, fog, and wind that can transform a pleasant walk into a survival situation. The region draws hundreds of thousands of walkers each year. Most complete their journeys without incident, returning with photographs and memories and stories of encounters with the landscape's beauty. A small number do not return, their disappearances adding to a history of people who have been lost to the Scottish mountains across centuries. Charles Kelly was planning a route in the Highlands, though specific details of his intended itinerary were not made public by investigators. What is known is that he departed for his walk and did not return when expected. When he failed to make contact with family and failed to appear at his anticipated destination, the alarm was raised. Police Scotland initiated a missing person investigation. Mountain rescue teams were mobilized, drawing on the network of volunteer organizations that respond to incidents throughout the Highlands. Helicopters were deployed to search from the air. Ground teams covered terrain in the area where he was believed to have been walking. The search faced challenges inherent to highland terrain. The landscape offers countless places where a person could become injured or incapacitated. steep slopes, rocky outcrops, boggy ground that can trap an unwary foot, river crossings that become dangerous after rainfall. Visibility can drop to near zero when clouds descend, transforming navigation into guesswork even for experienced walkers with maps and compasses. The search continued for weeks. Teams covered ground systematically, checking the routes he might have taken, examining the terrain for any sign of his passage. Helicopters flew patterns over areas that ground teams could not easily reach. The operation represented a significant commitment of resources and personnel. For approximately 7 weeks, Charles Kelly remained missing. Then, in a remote area of the Highlands, searchers discovered a body. The remains were subsequently identified as Charles Kelly. The location where he was found was not publicly disclosed, nor were details about the condition of the body or the specific circumstances of discovery. Police Scotland announced that the death was not being treated as suspicious, the standard language used when investigators believe the death resulted from accident, natural causes, or other non-criminal factors. The conclusion that his death was not suspicious provides a framework for understanding what happened, but does not provide the specific narrative that families and the public often seek. Non-suspicious death in the Highlands typically means one of several scenarios: a fall from height, a medical emergency such as heart attack or stroke, hypothermia resulting from exposure to weather, or drowning in one of the lochs or rivers that thread through the landscape. The 7-week gap between his disappearance and the discovery of his body raises questions that the official statement doesn't address. Where was he during those 7 weeks? Did he die shortly after departing on his walk, his body concealed in terrain that searchers did not reach? Or did he survive for some period, perhaps injured and unable to call for help, before eventually succumbing? The investigation examined the circumstances within the constraints of what could be determined. The first factor was the terrain where he was walking. The Highlands contain areas where a single misstep can result in fatal falls. Ridge wasps with exposure on both sides, rocky scrambles where handholds can fail, steep descents where loose scree creates unstable footing. An experienced walker can negotiate such terrain safely under good conditions, but faces significantly elevated risk when weather deteriorates. The second factor was the weather during the period of his disappearance. Scottish Highland weather in summer can vary from pleasant walking conditions to dangerous exposure within hours. If he encountered a weather system that brought rain, wind, and reduced visibility, his situation could have deteriorated rapidly, even on terrain he had planned to traverse safely. The third factor was communication. The Highlands have extensive areas without mobile phone coverage. If Charles encountered difficulty in such an area, he would have been unable to call for help. His only option would have been to self-rescue or to wait for assistance that might not know to come. The fourth factor was the 7-week timeline. Bodies in Highland terrain are sometimes found quickly, within days of disappearance, when they are located near trails or in areas that searchers cover early in operations. Other bodies are found only after extended periods, concealed in terrain that is difficult to access or that was not included in initial search areas. The 7-week gap suggests that Charles was located in terrain that wasn't reached during the initial intensive search phase. The fifth factor was the determination that his death was not suspicious. This conclusion indicates that investigators found no evidence of foul play, no indication that another person was involved in his death. It suggests that whatever happened to Charles resulted from accident, medical emergency, or environmental exposure rather than criminal action. The investigation developed several scenarios consistent with the available information. The first scenario was a fall. Perhaps Charles was traversing exposed terrain when he lost his footing, falling into a location that wasn't visible from standard search routes. Highland terrain contains gullies, ravines, and steep-sided corries, where a fallen person would be concealed from view unless searchers approached from specific angles. The second scenario was a medical emergency. Perhaps he suffered a heart attack, stroke, or other sudden medical event while walking. He would have collapsed where he stood, his body remaining in place until discovered. The location would need to be one that searchers did not reach during the initial operation, but eventually checked during expanded efforts. The third scenario was exposure. Perhaps weather conditions deteriorated while he was in a remote location, and he was unable to find shelter or descend to safety. Hypothermia can affect judgment, causing people to make decisions that worsen their situation. He may have sought shelter in a location that concealed him from searchers, while he slowly succumbed to the cold. The fourth scenario combined elements of the others. Perhaps he suffered a minor injury that impaired his mobility, then was unable to find his way to safety as weather closed in, eventually dying from the combination of injury and exposure. Such scenarios are common in highland fatalities, where initial minor problems cascade into fatal outcomes. The fifth scenario acknowledged that the specific sequence of events could not be determined. Charles Kelly walked into the highlands and did not return. His body was found 7 weeks later. The death was not suspicious. Beyond these facts, the details of what happened remain known only to the mountain. The case differs from others in this series because an intact body was recovered, rather than fragmentary remains. Most cases we examine involve disappearances, where no remains are ever found, where families are denied even the closure of knowing what happened. Charles Kelly's family received his remains and could conduct the rituals of mourning that permanent disappearance denies. But the 7 weeks of uncertainty, the weeks when he was simply gone, when searchers covered the hills looking for someone who could not be found, when family waited without knowing whether he was alive or dead, those weeks share the same quality as the years that families of the permanently missing endure. The not knowing, the imagining, the hope that fades, but never entirely dies. The highlands continue to draw walkers who seek the beauty and challenge of Scottish mountains. Most return safely. Some do not. The landscape does not distinguish between the experienced and the novice, the prepared and the careless. It simply presents conditions, and those who enter must navigate whatever conditions they encounter. Charles Kelly was experienced. He knew the terrain. He understood the risks. He went walking in the hills he had walked before, and something happened that ended his life in a location where searchers could not find him for 7 weeks. The mountain does not explain what that something was. It keeps its knowledge as it has kept knowledge for 10,000 years, since the glaciers retreated and left behind the landscape that humans would eventually name the Highlands. 4,000 miles to the east, in mountains that dwarf the Scottish peaks, another disappearance was unfolding that would remain unresolved far longer than 7 weeks. The victim was a young American woman whose experience and preparation should have protected her on a route that thousands of trekkers complete safely each year. The terrain was Nepal's Langtang region, a corridor of valleys and peaks that leads toward the Tibetan border through some of the most spectacular scenery on Earth. Aubrey Sacco was 23 years old when she arrived in Nepal in the spring of 2010. She was from Boulder County, Colorado, a region where outdoor recreation is woven into daily life and where young people grow up hiking, climbing, and skiing in the Rocky Mountains. She had graduated from college and was pursuing interests in yoga and holistic wellness, with plans to become an instructor and possibly to work in wellness tourism. Her trip to Nepal combined multiple motivations. She wanted to experience the country's spiritual traditions, to practice yoga in a land where the discipline has ancient roots, and to trek in the Himalayas that had drawn adventurers and seekers for generations. She was traveling solo, a choice that reflected both her independent spirit and her confidence in her abilities. She had experience that supported that confidence. She had traveled internationally before. She had hiked extensively in the Colorado mountains. She was physically fit and mentally prepared for the challenges of Himalayan trekking. She was not a naive tourist stumbling into terrain she did not understand. Her plan included trekking in the Langtang region, north of Kathmandu, in an area that offers spectacular mountain scenery without the extreme altitude of the Everest or Annapurna regions. The Langtang Valley trek typically takes 7 to 10 days, following a route through villages where trekkers can find food and accommodation, climbing gradually from subtropical forest to alpine meadows beneath glaciated peaks. The trek is considered moderate by Himalayan standards. It does not require technical climbing skills or specialized equipment. Thousands of trekkers complete it each year, most without incident. The infrastructure of tea houses and lodges means that trekkers do not need to carry camping equipment or supplies for extended self-sufficiency. Aubrey arrived in the Langtang region in late April of 2010. She was seen in several villages along the trekking route, her presence noted by lodge owners and other trekkers who encountered her on the trail. She was moving through the valley as planned, making progress toward the higher elevations that offered views of the surrounding peaks. The last confirmed sighting of Aubrey Sacco was in Langtang village, a settlement at approximately 11,500 feet elevation that serves as a stopping point for trekkers heading deeper into the valley. Witnesses reported seeing her in the village, apparently in good spirits and good health. She indicated to some that she planned to continue up the valley, possibly to visit the glacial lake at Kianjin-Gompa, or to explore higher viewpoints in the area. After that sighting, she vanished. When she failed to contact her family at the expected time, when she did not appear at her arranged accommodations in Kathmandu, when the days stretched into weeks without word, her family raised the alarm. Her mother, Connie Sacco, would become a tireless advocate for her daughter, traveling to Nepal multiple times, organizing searches, engaging Nepali officials and American diplomats, and refusing to accept that her daughter had simply disappeared. The initial search efforts were limited by the challenges of the terrain and the infrastructure available in rural Nepal. Local authorities checked the trail and the villages along the route. Lodge owners were questioned about when they had seen Aubrey and what she had said about her plans. Trekkers who had been in the area were contacted and asked for any information. The results were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Aubrey continuing up the valley beyond Langtang village. Others said they had not seen her after a certain date. Some reported interactions that could not be precisely dated, their memories of one trekker among many blurring into uncertainty. No physical evidence of Aubrey was found. Not her backpack, not her clothing, not her passport or other documents, not any item that could confirm where she had gone after leaving Langtang village. The trail that she had followed to that point simply ended, as if she had walked out of the observable world and into somewhere that searching could not reach. The investigation expanded over time, driven largely by the determination of her family. American diplomatic personnel became involved. The case received media attention that increased pressure on Nepali authorities to devote resources to finding her. Professional search consultants were engaged. Multiple trips to Nepal produced additional interviews, additional searches, and additional dead ends. Among the developments that emerged was awareness that Aubrey Sacco was not the only trekker to have disappeared mysteriously in the Langtang region. Other cases, some predating hers and some following, shared similar characteristics. Travelers on established routes who vanished without trace, their disappearances never conclusively explained. This pattern led some investigators to consider whether the disappearances were connected, whether something about the Langtang region specifically, rather than Himalayan trekking generally, was producing these outcomes. The unofficial designation of Langtang backpacker disappearances emerged in discussions among those researching the cases. The investigation examined the factors that might explain what happened to Aubrey. The first factor was the terrain. The Langtang Valley is bounded by steep ridges and peaks that rise thousands of feet above the valley floor. The trail follows the valley, but crosses terrain where a fall could be fatal, and where a body could be concealed in locations that searchers would not easily reach. Glacial moraines, rocky slopes, and dense vegetation in lower sections all provide potential concealment. The second factor was the altitude. At 11,000 feet and higher, altitude sickness can affect even fit and acclimatized trekkers. Symptoms can include impaired judgment, confusion, and physical weakness. If Aubrey experienced altitude-related problems, her decision-making might have been compromised in ways that led her into dangerous situations. The third factor was weather. April in the Langtang region can see rapid weather changes, with storms that bring snow at higher elevations and rain lower down. If Aubrey was caught in deteriorating weather while above Langtang village, her situation could have become dangerous quickly. The fourth factor was the possibility of criminal activity. The Langtang region, while generally safe, is remote and lacks the oversight that more developed trekking areas receive. The possibility that Aubrey encountered someone who harmed her was investigated, but never confirmed. No suspects were identified. No evidence of violence was found. The fifth factor was the contradictory witness accounts. Different people reported seeing her at different times and places, some of which could not all be accurate. These contradictions complicated efforts to establish a timeline and to focus search efforts on the most likely areas. The investigation developed several theories about what might have happened. The first theory was a trekking accident. Perhaps Aubrey slipped on a steep section of trail, fell into a ravine or gorge, and died from her injuries. Her body would have been concealed in terrain that searchers could not access, or could not see from the trails and viewpoints they covered. This theory is consistent with many Himalayan trekking fatalities. The terrain is unforgiving of mistakes. A single misstep in the wrong location can be fatal, and bodies in remote Himalayan terrain can remain undiscovered indefinitely. The second theory was a medical emergency. Perhaps Aubrey suffered acute altitude sickness, a cardiac event, or some other medical crisis that incapacitated her. If this occurred in a location away from the main trail, she might have collapsed where she could not be seen and could not call for help. The third theory was that she became lost. Perhaps she left the main trail to explore a side valley or to reach a viewpoint, became disoriented, and was unable to find her way back. The Langtang region contains numerous side valleys and routes that are not on standard maps. A trekker who ventured off the main path could become seriously lost in terrain where navigation is difficult. The fourth theory was criminal involvement. Perhaps Aubrey encountered someone, local or foreign, who harmed her for reasons ranging from robbery to assault. Her body might have been concealed by a perpetrator who was never identified. The lack of any evidence supporting this theory does not eliminate it, as a crime committed in remote terrain might leave no witnesses and minimal physical evidence. The fifth theory connected her disappearance to the pattern of other missing trekkers in the region. Some investigators have suggested that the Langtang area has characteristics, geographic, social, or otherwise, that produce an elevated rate of disappearances compared to other trekking regions. What those characteristics might be has never been established, but the clustering of cases in a relatively small area has attracted attention from researchers. The sixth theory acknowledged that the evidence was insufficient to determine what happened. Aubrey Sacco walked into the Langtang Valley, was seen in several villages, and then vanished completely. Despite years of effort by her family, despite diplomatic pressure and media attention, despite multiple search operations, no trace of her has ever been found. Her mother Connie continued searching for years after the disappearance. She traveled to Nepal repeatedly. She hired investigators. She met with officials at every level. She refused to accept that her daughter had simply vanished without explanation. The effort was driven by love and by the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing. The 2015 earthquake that devastated Nepal included the Langtang region among the hardest hit areas. Langtang village itself was largely destroyed by an avalanche triggered by the earthquake, killing hundreds of people and burying the settlement under tons of debris. The disaster transformed the landscape that Aubrey had walked through, potentially concealing any evidence that might have remained. Some have speculated that the earthquake might eventually reveal remains that were previously concealed, as debris settles and terrain shifts over time. To date, nothing connected to Aubrey Sacco has been discovered. Her case remains officially open, classified as a missing person whose fate has never been determined. She joined the list of travelers who enter the Himalayas each year and do not return, their disappearances absorbed by mountains that have witnessed human presence for only a fraction of their existence. The Langtang Valley has been rebuilt since the earthquake. Trekkers once again walk the route that Aubrey walked. The villages have been reconstructed. The lodges have reopened. The spectacular scenery remains as it was before the disaster, as it was when Aubrey saw it, as it will be long after everyone who remembers her is gone. The mountains do not remember individual humans. They operate on timescales that reduce human lifespans to insignificance. They have seen countless people pass through their valleys and across their ridges, and they have kept some of those people forever. Aubrey Sacco appears to be one of the kept. Whatever happened to her in the spring of 2010, whatever sequence of events transformed a trek on a popular route into permanent disappearance, remains unknown. Her family continues to hope for answers. The mountains continue their silence. The pattern that connects these international cases is not explained by any single factor. Sam Dubal disappeared in temperate rainforest. Kris and Lisanne disappeared in tropical jungle. Charles Kelly disappeared in Scottish moorland. Aubrey Sacco disappeared in Himalayan alpine terrain. The ecosystems are different. The elevations are different. The cultures and infrastructure and investigating authorities are all different. What remains constant is the outcome. People enter wilderness areas, follow established routes, and vanish in ways that searches cannot resolve. The phenomenon is not American. It is not European or Asian or Central American. It is global, appearing wherever wilderness exists in sufficient scale to absorb those who enter it. Some researchers have proposed that the cases share characteristics beyond geography. They note that many victims were traveling solo or in small groups. They note that many were on popular routes rather than remote expeditions. They note that the disappearances often involve periods of normal progress followed by sudden absence, as if the person simply stopped existing at a certain point. These observations describe patterns, but do not explain them. The patterns might reflect selection bias. Solo travelers on popular routes are more likely to be noticed missing and more likely to generate documented cases. Or, the patterns might reflect something about how wilderness disappearances actually occur, some mechanism that operates across different terrain types and different continents. The honest assessment is that we do not know why the pattern repeats. We can document the cases. We can note the similarities. We can observe that the phenomenon crosses borders and cultures and terrain types. But we cannot explain why people who do everything right still vanish, why searches with appropriate resources still fail, why wilderness areas that see thousands of safe passages still claim victims who are never found. The final case comes from South America, demonstrating the pattern in yet another context. A young Canadian traveler on one of Peru's most popular trekking routes, his disappearance generating a search that involved multiple countries and produced no resolution. The case shares elements with all those examined previously. Solo travel, popular route, normal progress followed by sudden absence, extensive search, no remains recovered. A family left with questions that years of effort have not answered. The pattern continues. The questions persist. And the wilderness, whether it wears the face of Pacific Northwest mountains or Scottish moors or Himalayan valleys or Andean peaks, continues to demonstrate its capacity to take people and keep them. The patterns we document demand attention that they have not received from investigators constrained by national boundaries and jurisdictional limits. The researchers who study these patterns learn from perspectives outside formal investigation. The insights you share may contribute to understanding that official channels have not achieved. The wilderness speaks the same language everywhere. Learning to understand that language requires looking beyond any single case, any single country, any single set of assumptions about what the wilderness can and cannot do. It can take people. That much is clear. What happens to them after? Where they go? Why searches cannot find them? These questions remain unanswered in Scotland, as they remain unanswered in Washington, in Panama, in Nepal. The cases examined so far span 4 countries and 3 continents. They involve victims ranging in age from 21 to 56, from students on gap years to established professionals, from casual day hikers to experienced mountain walkers. The terrain ranges from the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest to the cloud forests of Panama, to the moorlands of Scotland, to the high valleys of Nepal. The diversity of circumstances makes the consistency of outcomes more striking. These are not cases that cluster around a single terrain type, or a single victim profile, or a single set of weather conditions. They cluster around an outcome. People who enter wilderness, follow established routes, and vanish without leaving traces that searches can identify. The clustering might be coincidental. Perhaps these cases simply represent the visible portion of a larger phenomenon that affects all wilderness areas proportionally. and the apparent pattern reflects what gets documented and publicized rather than any real concentration. Perhaps disappearances of this type occur everywhere, constantly, and we notice certain cases because they involve circumstances that attract attention, or the clustering might indicate something real. Perhaps certain conditions, not geographic but procedural, produce elevated risk of unexplained disappearance. Solo travel, popular routes that create false confidence, terrain that appears manageable but contains concealed hazards, communication gaps that prevent timely recognition that something has gone wrong. The international scope of the cases argues against purely local explanations. If disappearances in Mount Rainier were caused by something specific to that mountain, we would not expect the same pattern in Scottish Highlands or Panamanian jungle or Nepali valleys. The repetition across such different environments suggests that the phenomenon is not about any particular place, but about the interaction between human behavior and wilderness conditions generally. This has implications for how we understand risk in wilderness settings. Safety guidance typically focuses on terrain-specific hazards, avalanche danger in mountains, flash flood risk in canyons, wildlife encounters in bear country. Such guidance is valuable, but may not address the factors that produce the cases documented here. The victims in these cases were not killed by avalanches, flash floods, or wildlife attacks, or if they were, the evidence was never found. They simply disappeared. The hazard that claimed them does not appear in guidebooks because no one can identify what it was. Some researchers have proposed that the cases reflect limitations in human attention and memory rather than any actual pattern. They suggest that confirmation bias leads us to remember cases that fit the pattern while forgetting cases that do not. They note that thousands of people complete wilderness trips safely for everyone who disappears, and that the apparent clustering of cases is an illusion produced by selective attention. This critique has merit, but does not fully account for the evidence. The cases documented here were not selected to fit a predetermined pattern. They were selected because they share characteristics that distinguish them from ordinary wilderness fatalities: the absence of any physical evidence, the failure of extensive searches, the lack of any satisfying explanation. These are not ordinary cases filtered through confirmation bias. They are extraordinary cases that resist the explanations that account for ordinary incidents. The critique also does not explain why the cases repeat across such different contexts. If the pattern were purely an artifact of how we remember and report cases, we would expect it to vary with cultural differences in media coverage, investigative practices, and public attention. Instead, the pattern appears in countries with very different approaches to wilderness safety and missing persons investigation. What we are left with is documentation without explanation. The cases exist. The pattern appears. The explanation eludes us. This uncertainty is uncomfortable, but honest. The alternative, forcing explanations onto evidence that does not support them, would satisfy the desire for closure, but would not serve understanding. Better to acknowledge what we do not know than to pretend to knowledge we do not have. The families of the missing live with this uncertainty daily. They cannot pretend that answers exist when answers do not exist. They cannot find comfort in explanations that explain nothing. They can only continue hoping, continue searching, continue wondering what happened to the people they loved who walked into wilderness and did not return. The international scope of the cases means that families in different countries share this experience. The Dubal family in the United States, the Kremers and Froon families in the Netherlands, Charles Kelly's family in Scotland, Connie Sacco in Colorado waiting for news from Nepal. They speak different languages, live in different cultures, navigate different bureaucracies. They share the same uncertainty, the same unanswered questions, the same silence from wilderness that will not reveal what it knows. The final case in this international examination takes us to South America, to the high Andes of Peru, where glaciated peaks rise above 17,000 feet, and trekking routes thread through valleys that have witnessed human passage for millennia. The Cordillera Blanca, the White Range, contains the highest concentration of tropical glaciers on Earth, a landscape of ice and rock that draws mountaineers and trekkers from around the world. The victim was a young Canadian whose disappearance would mobilize his family into an international search effort that revealed both the dedication of those who refused to accept silence as an answer and the limitations of systems designed to track travelers in remote terrain. His case shares every characteristic of the others examined in this series: popular route, experienced traveler, normal progress followed by sudden absence, extensive search, no resolution. It also adds elements that the other cases did not include: witnesses who reported seeing him on the trail, descriptions of his condition that suggested something was already going wrong, a registration system that should have recorded his presence, but apparently did not. The case is not simply a disappearance, but a disappearance with fragments of evidence that make the absence of resolution even more frustrating. The pattern that began in Mount Rainier, continued through Panama and Scotland and Nepal, completes its circuit in the Peruvian Highlands. 5 countries, 4 continents, 5 cases that share an outcome while differing in every specific detail. Jesse Galganov was 22 years old when he arrived in Peru in the autumn of 2017. He was from Montreal, a university student who had decided to take a gap year for travel before continuing his education. He was described by those who knew him as adventurous, physically fit, and eager to experience the world beyond the familiar boundaries of Canadian life. His travel plans were ambitious but not unusual for young people of his generation. He intended to explore South America before continuing to other continents, accumulating experiences that would shape his understanding of the world and his place in it. Peru was an early stop on an itinerary that was supposed to extend to South Africa and beyond. The Santa Cruz trek was a logical choice for someone seeking Andean adventure. The route is considered one of the most beautiful treks in South America, a 4-day journey through the Cordillera Blanca that passes beneath glaciated peaks, crosses high passes, and traverses landscapes that range from subtropical valley floors to alpine terrain above 14,000 feet. The trek attracts thousands of visitors each year, most of whom complete it without incident. The route typically begins near the town of Huaraz, which serves as a base for trekking and mountaineering throughout the Cordillera Blanca. From Huaraz, trekkers travel to the village of Cachapampa, or Vaqueria, depending on which direction they choose to hike the loop. The trail climbs through progressively higher terrain, reaching a maximum elevation of approximately 15,700 feet at Punta Union Pass, before descending through the Santa Cruz Valley. Jesse arrived in Huaraz in late September or early October of 2017. He was preparing for the Santa Cruz trek, gathering supplies and making arrangements for the journey. He appears to have been traveling solo at this point, though he may have intended to join other trekkers on the trail or to hire a guide for portions of the route. The registration system for trekkers in the Cordillera Blanca requires hikers to sign in at checkpoints, providing their names, nationalities, and intended routes. This system is designed to track who enters the backcountry and to facilitate search efforts if someone fails to return. The system depends on trekkers actually registering, which does not always occur. When investigators later checked the registration records at the trailhead where Jesse should have signed in, his name was not present. In fact, according to some reports, no one had officially registered on the day he was believed to have started the trek. This absence of documentation complicated efforts to establish a definitive timeline for his movements. Despite the lack of registration, witnesses reported seeing Jesse on the trail. A group of French tourists later told investigators that they had encountered a young man matching his description on the Santa Cruz trek. They described him as appearing tired and somewhat disoriented, observations that would take on significance as the investigation progressed. A group of Czech trekkers reported a similar encounter. They recalled that a young Canadian had approached them asking about water sources and where he could refill his supply. This interaction suggested that Jesse might have been experiencing dehydration or had underestimated the water requirements for the trek. At high altitude, dehydration accelerates and can contribute to altitude sickness, compounding problems that might otherwise be manageable. These witness accounts placed Jesse on the trail, but raised questions about his condition. If he was already tired, disoriented, and concerned about water relatively early in the trek, his situation may have been deteriorating before he reached the most challenging sections of the route. After these sightings, Jesse Galganov vanished. He did not emerge from the trek at either endpoint. He did not contact his family at the expected time. He did not appear at his next planned destination. The silence that followed the witness sightings became permanent. When Jesse failed to make contact, his family raised the alarm. His mother, Elisa Klaman, would become the driving force behind efforts to find him, traveling to Peru herself to coordinate searches and to pressure authorities to devote resources to the case. Her determination exemplified the refusal to accept uncertainty that characterizes families of the missing, the insistence that someone, somewhere, must have answers. The search that followed involved Peruvian authorities, local rescue teams, and resources that the family helped to mobilize. Teams covered the Santa Cruz trek and surrounding terrain. They checked the route in both directions. They searched off-trail areas where a person might have wandered if lost or injured. They interviewed other trekkers and local residents who might have information. The terrain presented challenges familiar from other cases in this series. The Cordillera Blanca is vast and rugged, with countless features where a person could be concealed. Glacial moraines, rocky slopes, deep valleys, crevasses on the glaciated peaks above the trekking routes. The altitude complicated search efforts, limiting how long teams could work at high elevation and affecting the performance of both humans and dogs. Weather in the Andes can change rapidly, with storms that bring snow at higher elevations and rain lower down. Visibility can drop to near zero. Temperatures fall dramatically at night. A trekker caught in deteriorating conditions without adequate shelter could face life-threatening exposure within hours. The search continued for weeks. The family maintained pressure to continue efforts even as the probability of finding Jesse alive approached zero. Private search operators were engaged. Areas beyond the main trekking route were examined. Every lead was pursued. Nothing was found. Not his backpack, not his clothing, not his tent or sleeping bag or any equipment he would have been carrying, not his body, or any remains. The Cordillera Blanca had absorbed Jesse Galganov as completely as Mount Rainier had absorbed Sam Dubal, as completely as the Panamanian jungle had absorbed Kris and Lisanne. The investigation examined the factors that might explain what happened. The first factor was altitude. The Santa Cruz trek reaches elevations where altitude sickness is a significant risk. Acute mountain sickness can cause headaches, nausea, and fatigue. More severe forms, high-altitude pulmonary edema and high-altitude cerebral edema, can be fatal if not recognized and treated. The witness descriptions of Jesse appearing tired and disoriented are consistent with early altitude sickness symptoms. If Jesse was developing altitude sickness, his judgment might have been impaired. He might have made decisions that a fully functioning person would recognize as dangerous. He might have continued climbing when he should have descended. He might have left the trail for reasons that made sense to an oxygen-deprived brain, but would seem inexplicable to a healthy observer. The second factor was the witness accounts of dehydration concerns. Asking other trekkers about water sources suggests that Jesse may not have been carrying adequate water or may have underestimated consumption rates at altitude. Dehydration compounds the effects of altitude sickness, creating a feedback loop that can rapidly deteriorate a person's condition. The third factor was the lack of registration. If Jesse did not sign in at the trailhead checkpoint, search teams could not know with certainty where he had entered the trail or which direction he was hiking. This uncertainty expanded the potential search area and complicated efforts to focus resources on the most likely locations. The fourth factor was the terrain itself. The Cordillera Blanca contains hazards that can claim even experienced mountaineers. Glacial crevasses concealed by snow bridges can trap those who venture onto ice. Loose rock on steep slopes can cause fatal falls. Rivers swollen by glacial melt can be dangerous to cross. Any of these hazards could have claimed Jesse without leaving evidence that searchers would find. The fifth factor was the remoteness. While the Santa Cruz trek is popular by Andean standards, it passes through terrain that is far from any settlement or road. If Jesse encountered difficulty in one of the more remote sections, help would have been hours or days away, even if he could communicate his need. The investigation developed several theories about what might have happened. The first theory was altitude sickness leading to incapacitation. Perhaps Jesse developed severe altitude sickness that affected his judgment and physical capability. Perhaps he wandered off the trail in a confused state, collapsed somewhere in the terrain beyond the established route, and died before he could be found. This theory is consistent with the witness accounts of his appearing tired and disoriented. It explains why he might have left the trail and why his body might be in a location that searchers did not reach. The second theory was a fall into a crevasse or other concealed hazard. Perhaps Jesse ventured onto terrain where hidden dangers claimed him. Glacial crevasses can be covered by snow that appears solid but gives way under a person's weight. A fall into such a crevasse could be fatal and could leave the body concealed below the surface indefinitely. The Santa Cruz trek does not normally require crossing glaciated terrain, but a trekker who wandered off route, perhaps due to disorientation from altitude sickness, could reach glacial areas where crevasses are present. The third theory was a fall on the steep terrain that characterizes much of the route. Punta Union Pass, the high point of the trek, is surrounded by steep slopes where a slip could result in a long, tumbling fall. A body that came to rest in a ravine or behind rock formations might not be visible from the trail or from helicopter searches. The fourth theory was hypothermia. Perhaps Jesse was caught by weather while in an exposed position, perhaps already weakened by altitude sickness or dehydration. Hypothermia can set in rapidly at high altitude, especially if a person is wet from rain or snow. The condition impairs judgment before it impairs physical function, leading people to make decisions that worsen their situation. The fifth theory was criminal activity. The Cordillera Blanca is generally considered safe for trekkers, but crimes against tourists do occur in Peru. Perhaps Jesse encountered someone who robbed and killed him, concealing the body in remote terrain. This theory lacks supporting evidence, but cannot be definitively ruled out given the absence of any physical findings. The sixth theory connected his disappearance to the pattern of other missing trekkers in the Andes. Jesse was not the first person to vanish on the Santa Cruz trek or in the broader Cordillera Blanca region. Other cases, some involving solo travelers and some involving small groups, share similar characteristics. Whether these cases are connected by anything other than geography has never been established. The seventh theory acknowledged that the evidence was insufficient to determine what happened. Jesse Galganov entered the Cordillera Blanca, was seen by other trekkers appearing unwell, and then vanished completely. Despite extensive searches and years of effort by his family, no trace of him has ever been found. His mother, Elisa Klamen, has continued advocating for attention to missing travelers and for improved systems to track trekkers in remote areas. Her experience searching for Jesse revealed gaps in how different countries coordinate when travelers disappear, how registration systems fail to capture everyone who enters backcountry areas, how families are left to navigate bureaucracies in countries where they do not speak the language or understand the systems. The case has been featured in media coverage that highlights both Jesse specifically and the broader phenomenon of missing travelers. His story has become part of a larger conversation about risks that young travelers face, about the limitations of infrastructure in remote regions, and about what families endure when loved ones vanish in foreign countries. The Cordillera Blanca continues to draw trekkers and mountaineers. The Santa Cruz trek remains one of the most popular routes in the Peruvian Andes. Thousands complete it safely each year, returning with photographs and stories of one of South America's most spectacular landscapes. Jesse Galganov is not among them. He walked into those mountains in the autumn of 2017 and did not walk out. His family waits for answers that may never come. The mountains keep their silence. 5 cases examined, 5 countries spanning 4 continents, victims ranging in age from 21 to 56, from gap year students to university professors, from casual hikers to experienced mountain walkers, terrain ranging from Pacific Northwest rainforest to Central American cloud forest, to Scottish moorland, to Himalayan valleys, to Andean highlands. The diversity of circumstances makes the consistency of outcomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. these cases do not cluster around a single terrain type or a single victim profile. They cluster around an outcome. People who enter wilderness make normal progress along established routes, and then vanish in ways that extensive searches cannot resolve. The pattern has consistent elements that appear across all 5 cases. First, the routes were established and popular. None of these victims were attempting pioneering expeditions into unknown terrain. Sam Dubal was hiking a loop in a national park that sees hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Kris and Lisanne were walking a trail that day hikers use regularly. Charles Kelly was in the Scottish Highlands, where walking is a national pastime. Aubrey Sacco was on a trekking route with lodges and villages. Jesse Galganov was on one of Peru's most popular treks. The popularity of these routes creates a false sense of security. Because many people complete them safely, those who enter assume they will also complete them safely. The statistical reality supports this assumption. The vast majority of people who walk these routes return without incident. But the cases documented here represent the exceptions, the ones for whom the statistics failed to apply. Second, the victims were experienced enough to attempt what they were attempting. None were complete novices stumbling into terrain they did not understand. Sam Dubal had years of Pacific Northwest hiking experience. Kris and Lisanne were not expert mountaineers, but were capable of the day hike they attempted. Charles Kelly was an experienced hill walker. Aubrey Sacco had extensive outdoor experience in Colorado. Jesse Galganov was physically fit and adventure-oriented. Their experience did not protect them. Whatever happened to these people, it was not the result of obvious incompetence or reckless overreach. They were doing things within their capabilities on routes within their skill levels. The hazard that claimed them was not one that experience had taught them to recognize. Third, there was a period of normal progress followed by sudden absence. In each case, the victim was observed or communicated that things were fine before vanishing. Sam sent a message saying everything was going according to plan. Kris and Lisanne were photographed walking normally on the trail. Aubrey was seen in good spirits in Langtang village. Jesse was seen on the trail, apparently still mobile, even if showing signs of fatigue. Charles departed for a walk he had done before. The transition from normal to absent happened quickly. There was no gradual deterioration that others could observe and intervene in. There was presence, then absence, with no intermediate state visible to witnesses or recorded in evidence. Fourth, extensive searches produced no results. Each case involved search operations appropriate to the terrain and resources available. Search and rescue teams, helicopters, dogs, thermal imaging, volunteer efforts, family-funded private searches. The searches were not token efforts. They represented serious attempts to locate missing people in terrain where missing people can sometimes be found. They found nothing. Or in the cases of Kris and Lisanne and Charles Kelly, they found evidence that raised more questions than it answered. The backpack placed on a rock. The body discovered after 7 weeks. These findings provided no satisfying explanation for what happened during the critical period between last sighting and discovery. Fifth, no definitive explanation emerged. Each case generated theories: falls, medical emergencies, animal attacks, criminal activity, environmental exposure, altitude sickness. The theories are plausible individually. None is supported by evidence that confirms it over alternatives. The cases remain open not because investigators were incompetent, but because the evidence does not permit confident conclusions. The international scope of these cases challenges explanations that rely on local factors. If Sam Dubal's disappearance were caused by something specific to Mount Rainier, we would not expect the same outcome in Panama or Scotland or Nepal or Peru. The repetition across such different environments suggests that whatever produces these outcomes is not tied to any particular landscape. Some researchers have proposed that the common factor is human rather than environmental. They suggest that certain psychological states or decision-making patterns make people vulnerable regardless of terrain. Perhaps fatigue, dehydration, altitude, or other stressors impair judgment in ways that lead to fatal errors across different environments. Perhaps the victims made similar mistakes that are not visible in the evidence, because the evidence itself is absent. This theory is plausible, but difficult to test. We cannot know what decisions the victims made because we cannot reconstruct their final hours. We can only observe that something went wrong and that the wrong was severe enough to prevent recovery of any meaningful evidence. Other researchers have proposed that the phenomenon reflects limitations in search methodology rather than any real pattern in how disappearances occur. They suggest that wilderness areas are simply larger and more complex than search operations can comprehensively cover, and that a certain percentage of missing people will never be found, regardless of effort. The cases documented here may simply represent the tail end of a normal distribution, rather than evidence of any extraordinary phenomenon. This critique has merit. Wilderness is vast. Search resources are limited. The probability of finding a missing person decreases with time and with the size of the potential search area. It is statistically inevitable that some searches will fail, even when conducted competently. But this explanation does not fully account for the characteristics shared by these cases. The victims were on popular routes where search areas should be relatively constrained. They were not deep in trackless wilderness, but on trails that see regular traffic. The absence of any physical evidence, not just bodies, but any equipment, clothing, or personal effects, goes beyond what random distribution would predict. The honest conclusion is that we do not know what produces these outcomes. We can document the cases. We can note the patterns. We can propose theories. We cannot confirm any explanation with the evidence available. This uncertainty is unsatisfying, but accurate. The desire for explanation is human. The universe does not always provide explanations on demand. Sometimes we are left with questions that have no answers, at least no answers we can currently reach. The families of the missing live with this uncertainty as a daily reality. They cannot find comfort in explanations that do not exist. They cannot achieve closure when closure is not available. They can only continue hoping that someday, somehow, evidence will emerge that explains what happened to the people they loved. Their hope is not irrational. Cases that seemed permanently unsolved have sometimes yielded answers years or decades later. Remains have been discovered by chance. Witnesses have come forward with information they did not previously share. Technology has improved in ways that allow re-examination of evidence. The passage of time, which makes resolution less likely, does not make it impossible. But for most families of the missing, resolution never comes. They live with questions that will accompany them to their own deaths. They live with the peculiar grief of loss without certainty, of mourning someone who might, however improbably, still be alive somewhere. The international nature of these cases adds a dimension that purely domestic disappearances do not have. Families must navigate foreign legal systems, communicate across language barriers, pressure authorities in countries where they have no political standing. The challenges that any family faces when a loved one disappears are multiplied when the disappearance occurs in another country. There is no international framework for coordinating responses to missing travelers. Each country handles missing persons according to its own systems and resources. Information sharing between countries is inconsistent. Families often become the primary coordinators of searches that cross jurisdictional boundaries, a role they are not equipped for and should not need to fill. The cases documented here have contributed to conversations about improving systems for tracking travelers and responding when they disappear. Some countries have implemented better registration requirements for trekkers. Some have improved coordination between tourism authorities and search and rescue services. Some have developed protocols for communicating with families across international boundaries. These improvements are welcome, but insufficient. The fundamental challenge remains. Wilderness is large, humans are small, and the margin between a safe journey and a permanent disappearance can be measured in decisions that seem insignificant at the time they are made. The advice that emerges from studying these cases is familiar, but bears repeating. Travel with companions when possible. Register with authorities who track visitors. Carry communication devices that work in remote areas. Leave detailed itineraries with people who will notice if you do not return. Respect the terrain you are entering, and do not let familiarity breed complacency. This advice reduces risk, but does not eliminate it. The victims in these cases were not reckless. Some were following reasonable safety practices. They still disappeared. The wilderness does not owe anyone safe passage. It operates by rules that humans do not fully understand and cannot fully control. It has absorbed people for as long as people have entered it, and it will continue absorbing people for as long as wilderness exists. What we can do is document what happens, note the patterns, ask questions that deserve attention. Remember the people who walked into wild places and did not return. This video has examined 5 cases from 5 countries: a professor in Washington State, 2 students in Panama, a hill walker in Scotland, a yoga instructor in Nepal, a gap year traveler in Peru. They had different backgrounds, different levels of experience, different reasons for being where they were. They shared an outcome that none of them expected and that none of their families can explain. The wilderness kept them. That much we know. What we do not know is everything else. Where they went, what happened to them, why searches found nothing, why popular routes claimed people who were doing everything right. The questions persist across borders. The silence persists across continents. The pattern persists through every variation in terrain and culture and investigating authority. If you found value in this examination of international wilderness disappearances, subscribe to this channel. We will continue documenting cases that cross boundaries and challenge assumptions. We will continue asking questions that official investigations have not answered. Share your observations in the comments. The families of the missing read these discussions. Researchers studying the phenomenon monitor public conversation. The perspectives you contribute may contain insights that formal investigation has not achieved. The wilderness speaks the same language everywhere. It speaks of beauty and challenge and adventure. It also speaks of risk and loss and silence. Learning to hear all of what the wilderness says requires acknowledging that it does not always return what it takes. The people documented in this series walked into wild places expecting to walk out. Their families expected them home. The plans they made assumed they would complete them. The wilderness had different plans. What those plans were, we do not know. We know only the outcomes: absence, searches, questions without answers. 6 people, 5 countries, 1 pattern. The pattern continues somewhere in the world right now. Someone is walking into wilderness on a popular trail, expecting a routine trip, unaware that they will become the next case that searchers cannot solve and families cannot forget. We cannot predict who that person will be. We cannot prevent what we do not understand. We can only document, examine, and remember. The examination is complete. The questions remain. The families wait. The wilderness keeps its silence. And somewhere, in mountains and forests and jungles across the world, the pattern continues. Stay safe. Stay aware. Stay connected to the people who would search for you. And remember that the wilderness does not distinguish between those who return and those who do not. The 5 cases documented in this series represent a fraction of wilderness disappearances that occur globally each year. They were selected because they share characteristics that make them particularly difficult to explain, because they span geographic and cultural boundaries in ways that illuminate the universal nature of the phenomenon, and because they demonstrate the consistency of outcomes across vastly different circumstances. They are not unique. Every year, people disappear in wilderness areas around the world under circumstances that searches cannot resolve. Most of these cases receive limited attention, their details known only to local authorities and grieving families. A few like those examined here attract broader notice because of unusual circumstances, persistent family advocacy, or media interest that amplifies what would otherwise remain local tragedies. The number of unresolved wilderness disappearances is impossible to determine with precision. Different countries define and track missing persons differently. Wilderness areas vary in how thoroughly they monitor who enters and exits. Some disappearances are never reported because travelers were not expected anywhere specific, and no one noticed their absence. What can be said with confidence is that the phenomenon is real, persistent, and poorly understood. It does not affect only inexperienced travelers. It does not occur only in extreme terrain. It does not spare those who take precautions. It operates according to rules that we have not identified, selecting victims through criteria we do not understand. The cases share another characteristic that deserves attention: the burden placed on families. In each case, family members became the primary advocates for continued searching, for investigation, for attention to circumstances that official processes might otherwise have allowed to fade into bureaucratic closure. Connie Sacco traveled to Nepal multiple times, searching for her daughter Aubrey. Elisa Clamon flew to Peru to coordinate the search for her son, Jesse. The families of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon engaged investigators and pushed for continued attention to evidence that official conclusions left unexplained. Charles Kelly's family waited through 7 weeks of uncertainty before his body was discovered. These families did not choose to become experts in search and rescue, in international missing persons protocols, in navigating foreign bureaucracies while managing grief. The role was forced upon them by circumstances that no family anticipates. They rose to it because the alternative, accepting silence and moving on, was unbearable. Their efforts have produced mixed results. In some cases, family persistence led to discoveries that official searches had missed. In others, persistent effort yielded nothing except the knowledge that nothing more could be done. In all cases, family advocacy kept cases visible longer than they would have remained otherwise, preventing the quiet closure that missing persons files eventually receive. The advocacy has also contributed to broader awareness of wilderness disappearance as a phenomenon. Media coverage driven by family efforts has brought attention to cases that would otherwise be known only locally. Documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions have connected cases across countries and identified patterns that isolated investigation might miss. This public attention has value beyond any individual case. It creates pressure for better systems to track travelers and respond when they disappear. It generates information sharing that can contribute to understanding. It demonstrates that the public cares about these outcomes and expects authorities to take them seriously. The attention also carries risks. Speculation about cases can generate theories that are not supported by evidence. Families can be subjected to intrusive attention that compounds their grief. Misinformation can spread faster than correction, creating narratives that take on lives of their own, regardless of factual foundation. The cases in this series have all been subject to extensive public discussion and speculation. Theories range from the plausible to the fantastic. Some discussants treat the cases as puzzles to be solved through amateur analysis. Others treat them as evidence for various beliefs about wilderness, about predators, human or otherwise, about phenomena that mainstream investigation does not acknowledge. We have attempted to present these cases without sensationalism, focusing on documented facts and acknowledging what remains unknown. The temptation to force explanations onto ambiguous evidence is strong, but yielding to that temptation does not serve understanding. Better to sit with uncertainty than to pretend to knowledge that does not exist. The questions raised by these cases deserve continued attention from those with expertise and resources to investigate them. Why do extensive searches fail to find any trace of missing people on popular routes? Why does the pattern repeat across such different terrain types? What factors distinguish those who disappear from the vast majority who complete similar journeys safely? These questions may have answers that current methods cannot reach. Advances in search technology, in forensic analysis, in understanding of wilderness hazards may eventually illuminate what currently remains dark. Or, the answers may remain permanently beyond reach, the evidence too scattered and degraded to reconstruct what happened. The families of the missing must make peace with this uncertainty, or at least learn to live with it. There is no timeline for closure when closure may never come. There is no roadmap for grieving someone whose fate is unknown. Each family finds their own way through circumstances that no one should have to navigate. Some find meaning in advocacy, working to improve systems so that other families might not endure what they have endured. Some find meaning in memorializing their loved ones, ensuring that the missing are remembered as the people they were, rather than only as cases to be solved. Some find meaning in connection with other families of the missing, the shared experience creating bonds that outsiders cannot fully understand. None of these meanings replace what was lost. They are accommodations to loss, ways of continuing when continuation seems impossible. They are testaments to human resilience in the face of circumstances designed to break the spirit. The wilderness does not care about human meanings. It does not care about family grief or public attention or investigative efforts. It continues being what it is: vast, indifferent, beautiful, dangerous. It continues receiving those who enter it, and it continues keeping some of them forever. This video has documented 5 cases that illustrate how the wilderness operates across national boundaries. The documentation changes nothing about what happened to Sam Dubal, to Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, to Charles Kelly, to Aubrey Sacco, to Jesse Galganov. They remain missing, or in the cases where remains were found, they remain incompletely explained. The documentation may change something about how we understand the phenomenon. It may contribute to recognition that wilderness disappearance is not a local problem confined to specific terrain, but a global pattern that crosses borders and defies conventional explanation. It may prompt questions that lead to better answers than we currently have, or it may simply serve as a record, a memorial to people who deserved to come home and did not, a reminder that the wilderness has rules we do not understand and powers we cannot control. Either way, the documentation has value. The people who disappeared deserve to be remembered. The patterns deserve to be noted. The questions deserve to be asked. The wilderness will continue taking people. That seems certain based on everything we know. We cannot prevent what we do not understand. We can only be aware, be prepared, be humble in the face of forces larger than ourselves. The 6 people documented in this series were aware. They were prepared by the standards of their time and their experience. They entered wilderness expecting an adventure and found instead an ending that no one can explain. May their stories contribute to understanding that might someday prevent others from joining them in the ranks of the missing.